The night was quiet, but tension lurked in the silence. The deserted street was lit by sparse, dim streetlights, and every step echoed in the cold air. A policeman, patrolling in a car, slowed down at an intersection. His gaze, sharp and suspicious, stopped on the figure of a teenager walking along the curb with a bag in his hand. "There he is," the officer muttered, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "Look at him." The teenager was skinny, wearing a simple sweatshirt, worn jeans, and sneakers. He looked quite ordinary, but that wasn't enough for an officer. The inexplicable hatred that had always seemed natural to him flared up inside. The black kid with the bag? He's obviously stolen something. His mind raced. He parked the car a little farther away, opened the door slowly, and climbed out, slamming it louder than necessary. The sound shattered the silence of the night like a gunshot. The teenager froze for a moment when he heard it, but continued walking without looking back. "Hey, stop!" The officer's voice sounded like an order that could not be disobeyed. The teenager stopped abruptly. He didn't have time to turn around, but he could feel the cold stare at his back. He wanted to keep walking as if nothing had happened, but his legs felt woozy. There was a strange premonition inside that this collision could change everything. "Come here, slowly," the policeman said, putting his hand on his baton, as if preparing in advance for a conflict. The teenager turned around, trying not to make any sudden movements. He looked at the officer with his big, frightened eyes. The bag was just groceries from the store, but this officer wasn't going to figure it out. He had already decided everything for him. "What's in your bag?" the policeman asked sharply as he approached. "Groceries? I just came from the store," he mumbled, his voice trembling. "Yeah, the store then." The officer smirked. "Look, don't lie to me. I know your kind never play fair." These words hit the teenager like thunder. He didn't immediately know how to react. "People like you." The phrase echoed in his head. He looked at the policeman, trying to figure out how to prove his innocence, but he was getting closer. "Put the bag on the ground and put your hands up," the officer ordered. "But I didn't do anything," the teenager began. "I said, put it down." The policeman interrupted him sharply, pulling out his baton and lightly slapping it against his palm, making a frightening sound. The night no longer seemed quiet. It was filled with tension, fear, and the sound of a police officer's heavy footsteps. The officer didn't see the teenager in front of him. He saw a threat he had made up himself. The teenager, feeling the blood pounding in his temples, slowly lowered the bag to the ground, trying to avoid something inevitable. "Are you going to resist?" the policeman challenged, looking straight into the teenager's eyes. "No, he started, but was interrupted again. "Of course you will." The officer stepped closer, smirking cheekily. "You always resist. You think the laws don't apply to you?" This night was supposed to be a normal night for a teenager. The journey home from the store had been a short one, but now that route seemed endless. He couldn't understand why he was being treated like this. The only thing he could feel was the coldness of the baton, ready to come down on him at any second. The silence of the street was broken by heavy footsteps. The policeman walked confidently, measuredly, like a predator targeting prey. His massive boots clattered on the asphalt, each step like a shot, warning of danger. He stopped a few meters away from the teenager, straightened up and shouted loudly, "Freeze! Hands where I can see them!" The teenager, clutching the grocery bag to his chest, looked at the officer in confusion. His breathing became rapid and ragged, his heart pounding so loudly that it seemed anyone could hear it. He raised one hand and slowly reached out with the other, holding the bag. "I didn't do anything. I'm just going home," he said in a shaky voice. "Hands up," I said. The officer's voice became even louder, cold and full of contempt, as if every word was poisoned with hatred. "Are you deaf, or did you think you could ignore me?" The teenager hurriedly raised both hands, holding them above his head. The grocery bag slipped out and fell to the ground. A few apples and a carton of milk rolled out of it, but the teenager didn't even look at it. His gaze was fixed on the officer, who now came so close that only a few steps separated them. "What you got there?" The officer pointed to the scattered items. "You stole it, huh? Tell me honestly, where'd you get all this stuff? Did you take it out of the store before anyone saw it?" "No, sir. I bought this. Here's the receipt. The teenager began, but the officer stepped forward sharply, interrupting him. "Don't call me sir. You think one polite word will make up for your guilt? Men like you are all the same. Thieves, liars. You think I don't know that?" The teenager's eyes rounded with fear. He couldn't figure out what to do to stop this torrent of accusations. Every word he said seemed to add fuel to the fire. "I didn't steal anything. I have money. Please, let me explain." His voice trailed off, becoming quieter. He wanted to prove his innocence, but he could see that the officer was not interested. The policeman took another step forward, his hand gripping the baton tightly. He was so close now that the teenager could smell his breath. "Are you scared?" the officer asked with a wry grin. "And you should be. But you know what the funny thing is? Being scared doesn't change anything for you. You always go back to your dirty deeds." "I'm not a thief," the teen said quietly, trying not to look at the officer. "Not a thief?" The officer smirked, then leaned closer. "You're telling me you're legit? Prove it. Show me the check. Show me the money. Show me something other than that pathetic face of yours." The teenager tried to reach into his jeans pocket, where the check was actually located, but this movement only caused an immediate reaction. The police officer grabbed a baton and held it to the teenager's chest. "Slowly," I said, "slow." His voice rumbled like thunder. "You think I'm going to let you pull something out? Maybe a knife? Or a gun? They're always carrying something." "It's just a check." The teenager almost screamed, tears welling up in his eyes. "I swear, I just bought groceries. I didn't steal anything." The officer did not retreat. His face remained stern, as if carved from stone. He was enjoying this moment, feeling his superiority. "Do you know how many of your kind I've apprehended?" he said slowly, almost mockingly. "And you know what they have in common? None of them were innocent. They're always hiding something." The policeman's words hit harder than a baton. The teenager felt his legs begin to shake with fatigue and fear. Inside, he already knew that in the eyes of this officer, he would never be human. "On your knees," the policeman commanded, his voice icy. "Now, or I'll put you down myself." "Why? I didn't do anything," the teenager shouted in despair, his voice breaking. But the officer had already stepped closer, grabbing him by the shoulder and pushing him down. The teenager collapsed to his knees, feeling the rough asphalt against his skin. The baton loomed over him, its cold gleam reflecting the light of the street lamp. "There you go. Good boy," the officer said with a sneer. "Now you wait. We'll see what else you're hiding." There was silence in the air. But it wasn't a calm silence, it was a storm that was just beginning to gather strength. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and whether you've had something similar in your life. Share your thoughts, It's important. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on exciting new stories. And now, we continue. The teenager unconsciously took a step back, trying to increase the distance between himself and the officer. But this tiny attempt to retreat caused an immediate reaction. The cop snatched the baton with lightning speed, clenching it so tightly that his fingers turned white. He raised it to chest level, tapping it discreetly on his palm. Not a blow, but a clear warning. "You probably think you can just steal and walk away, don't you?" he said, slowly stepping closer. His voice was soaked with contempt, and his gaze bore into the teenager's, as if he saw not a human being but a criminal who supposedly deserved his punishment long ago. The teenager froze in place and raised his arms a little higher, feeling fear stiffen his entire body. "I didn't steal anything. I just—" The words came out of his mouth as if invisible fingers were squeezing his throat. "Just?" the officer interrupted, his voice rumbling like a thunderclap. "You're all saying the same thing. I'm just—" He mocked the teenager, grinning. "And then it turns out you've got money in your pockets that shouldn't be there, or something worse. Put your hands on your head. Now." The teen obeyed, his movements slow, careful. He was afraid that any wrong move would cause a new outburst of aggression. And the baton, shining in the faint light of the lanterns, seemed like an extension of the officer's hand, ready to fall on him at any moment. "You don't even try to explain where you got it," the officer continued, nodding at the bag of scattered foodstuffs. "You know why? Because it's your fault. It's always your fault." The teen tried to say something in response, but his throat was dry. He opened his mouth, but the sound that came out was barely audible. "What?" "Louder!" the policeman shouted sharply, taking a threatening step forward. "Are you afraid to speak? Or just don't know how to lie, so I'll believe you?" "Yeah, I can show you the check," the teenager finally squeezed out. His voice shook, and he instinctively pointed to the pocket where the small piece of paper lay. "Keep your hands up," the officer shouted, raising his baton higher. "You think I'm going to let you take something out of my pocket? Maybe a knife? How about a gun? You're all like that. Petty criminals who think they can get away with it." Those words hit harder than a baton could. The teenager felt tears come to his eyes, but he held back, forcing himself to keep his gaze up. There was only one thing on his mind. If I obeyed, he could leave me alone. But with each passing second, that hope was fading. "On your knees," the officer ordered again, his voice icy. "On your knees, I said, unless you want me to twist you right here." The teenager slowly sank to his knees, feeling the cold asphalt digging into his skin. His breathing became ragged, his heart pounding in his chest like a frenzy. He was helpless. Every look, every threat from the officer pressed down on him like a heavy weight that was impossible to shake off. "There you go. Good boy," the officer said with a chuckle, stepping even closer. "Now we're going to do it right. You will only speak if I ask, okay? Or do I need to remind you who's in charge?" The teenager barely nodded, lowering his head. He didn't want to look into those eyes that saw him only as a threat. But even in this humiliation of his, the officer didn't stop. "Did you think the laws weren't for people like you?" he continued, now walking around the teenager like a lion around its prey. "Did you think you could take whatever you wanted, go outside and just go home as if nothing had happened? No, man. Guys like you need to remember your place." The teenager was silent. Any word could have been taken as a challenge. He felt small and helpless, but something was beginning to boil inside. It was a faint, almost imperceptible feeling of anger that broke through the fear. So, the officer stopped right in front of him, baton at the ready. "Are you going to show me what's in your pockets, or do I have to do it myself? I warn you, if I find anything illegal, you'll be sorry you ever left the house." The teenager looked at him, not knowing what to say. At that moment, he realized that no matter how hard he tried to prove his innocence, this officer would never be interested. The cold air of the night no longer seemed quiet. People passing by began to slow their steps, looking back at the scene unfolding in front of them. Some stopped out of curiosity. Others pulled out their phones and turned on their cameras, eager to capture what was happening. The teenager felt every stare burn through him. The crowd grew, and the ground beneath his knees seemed to grow colder and harder. The policeman noticed the people and, instead of softening up, instead became louder and more aggressive. He liked the attention, and he was going to use it to completely destroy this teenager, not only physically, but also mentally. "Look at him," he said loudly, looking around the crowd. "Typical criminal. They're always like that, thinking the law doesn't apply to them." His voice was full of contempt and confidence. It was as if he were playing to the audience, savoring every moment. The teenager lowered his head, unable to bear the stares of the passers-by, who were now whispering among themselves. "Look, he can't even look me in the eye," the officer continued, taking a step back so the crowd could see the teenager. "He's afraid because he knows he's guilty. They're always afraid when they get caught red-handed." "I didn't do anything," the teen whispered quietly, but his voice was drowned in the flood of the officer's derogatory words. "What? Did you say something?" "Louder." The officer moved closer, leaning toward the teenager. His face was so close he could smell the coffee and cigarettes. "Or are you used to talking only when you're lying?" "I'm not lying." The teen's voice shook, but he still dared to answer. The officer laughed, but there was no kindness in his laugh. It was a loud, sarcastic laugh that echoed down the street. "Did you hear that?" He turned to the crowd, raising his baton and pointing it at the teenager. "He's not lying. That's news to me. Are you telling me I can't see who you are? You think I need more proof? Just looking at you is enough to know you're a take-it-or-leave-it kind of guy." Some of the audience began to turn away, not wanting to participate in this spectacle, but many stayed. The phones were pointed at the teenager, recording his every emotion, every drop of humiliation he felt. He felt small and insignificant under those stares, as if every person around him saw him as a criminal. "Get up!" the officer commanded, yanking the teenager sharply by the arm. The teenager swayed but rose, barely keeping his balance. The officer grabbed him roughly by the shoulder and turned him toward the crowd. "Here, look at him. Remember, men like him are the cause of all your problems. They steal, they cheat, they break our homes, they destroy our world. And you want me to just stand there and watch?" "That's not true." The teenager tried to object, but the officer immediately interrupted him, clutching his shoulder harder. "Shut up," he shouted, speaking so loudly that the teenager almost flinched. "Do you realize who you're talking to? I'm a lawman, and you're a nobody. Your only mistake in life was crossing me." The crowd began to whisper. Some asked if there was evidence. Others shouted that the policeman was overreacting. But the officer just grinned, ignoring the criticism. "Proof?" he said loudly, as if answering everyone at once. "I am proof. I see criminals every day, and I know what they look like. This one is no exception." The teenager stood with his head down, his eyes filled with tears that he struggled not to drop. Everything inside him was bursting with humiliation, anger, and powerlessness. He felt utterly helpless in front of this man who saw nothing in him but the color of his skin. And now, everyone has seen what a real threat looks like, the officer concluded, mockingly patting the teenager on the shoulder. So, if any of you happen to be his next victim, remember this moment. The crowd split in two as the officer dragged the teen to his car. The stares of passers-by continued to burn the teen's back, and the sounds of whispers and cameras still filming made it impossible to forget that this humiliation remained not only in this night, but in their phones, on the internet, in the memory of everyone who had seen it. The teenager stood motionless, his heart pounding frantically in his chest. When the policeman shouted the order again, his voice sounded like a thunderclap, menacing and overpowering. I said, "Get on your knees, now." But the teenager didn't move. Chaos raged in his head. On your knees? Why? I haven't done anything. His body refused to obey the order, and not out of stubbornness, out of pure terror and disbelief. He couldn't bring himself to believe this was happening to him. He was not a criminal. Why should he kneel before a crowd of people? The policeman frowned, his face twisted with irritation. He stepped forward, shoving the teenager sharply in the chest. "Didn't you hear me?" he growled. "I said kneel. The law has no tolerance for insolence." The teenager staggered, but steadied himself. Something like protest flashed in his eyes for a moment. He tried to speak. "I didn't do anything wrong. Why did you—" But his words were drowned in a furious shout. "Shut up! You think you can tell me what to do?" The policeman struck his palm with his baton again, creating a thud that echoed down the street. "Don't you realize who's in charge here, boy? It ain't you. It never will be." The crowd around them began to whisper. Some spectators looked worried, but no one dared to interfere. The cameras continued filming, capturing every moment of this humiliating scene. Someone quietly said, "It's too much." But the words dissolved into thin air. The policeman, noticing that the teenager was still standing, became even angrier. His face contorted into a mask of rage. "You think you can just stand there like nothing happened? You think I'm going to let you walk away?" He took a step forward, swinging the baton so close to the teenager's head that he instinctively recoiled. "One more move and I'll put you down. You understand me?" The teenager stared at him, his body trembling with fear. But he still didn't lower himself. There was only one thought running through his mind. If I submit, he won't stop. It won't end. He couldn't explain it in words, but he knew that kneeling before this man would mean the end of something important in himself. "Get down on your knees," I said. The officer shouted even louder, pushing the teenager harder. He staggered again, barely keeping his balance. "Why?" asked the teenager quietly, but loud enough to be heard by the closest part of the crowd. "Why do I have to fall to my knees?" "For what?" The words sounded like a challenge. The policeman stood still for a moment, as if surprised that this boy dared to ask a question. But his surprise was quickly replaced by anger. His hand clenched the baton again, and he raised it a little higher, as if he were about to strike. "For being nothing," he shouted, leaning closer to the teenager. "You think you can walk my streets, live among normal people like you're one of us? No, boy. People like you have always been and always will be on their knees." Those words hit the teenager harder than any blow. He felt a lump of pain and humiliation grow in his chest. His breathing quickened and his eyes began to fill with tears, which he tried his best to hold back. Disgruntled exclamations began to break out in the crowd. Someone shouted. "Leave him alone." Someone asked, "What did he do anyway?" The policeman turned to them, his face filled with rage. "What? You want to protect a criminal? Then come over here and try it." His voice was so loud that everyone was silent. He turned to the teenager again. "You see? No one can save you. You're alone." The teenager stood still, unmoving, like a statue. But inside him, everything was boiling. He couldn't understand how this man standing in front of him could hate him so much without knowing anything about him. "On your knees," I said. The officer repeated, his voice already shaking with anger. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the teenager to finally break. But he didn't move. In that moment, even his fear gave way to something else. He no longer tried to make excuses or explain himself. He just stood there. The policeman, realizing that he could not force the teenager to obey, raised his baton higher. His rage was ready to burst out. But before he struck, he stopped, feeling dozens of eyes watching him. The cameras kept rolling, and the outraged voices in the crowd grew louder. He reprimanded himself, dropping the baton on his shoulder, and threw it angrily. "You chose it," and pulled the teenager toward the car again, pushing him in a way that showed everyone around him who was in charge. The policeman snatched the bag from the teenager's hands sharply, as if it were a thing that could not be trusted. His face was a mixture of contempt and smugness. The crowd watched in tense silence, only the sounds of the rustling bag and the officer's muffled footsteps breaking the strange atmosphere. "What have we got here?" the policeman mockingly said, taking things out of the bag. "Oh, bread, milk, a couple of apples. Did you steal that? Is that the best you can do?" He threw the groceries to the ground as if they were disgusting. A carton of milk fell and burst, spreading a white stain on the asphalt. Apples rolled in different directions, one of them stopping at someone's foot. "Do you see this?" The policeman turned to the crowd, pointing to the groceries that were now lying in the dirt. "Surely this petty thief must have stolen all this, and then thinks he can just go home." "I didn't steal anything." The teenager's voice shook, but he tried to speak louder. His fear fought with despair. "I have the receipt. I can show you." The policeman turned around, his face contorted in a mocking grin. "Check," he said, as if the word was a ridiculous joke. "Of course you have a check. Or maybe you're just going to draw it. We know your tricks. Check the store." The teenager took a step forward, but immediately stopped when he saw the officer raise his baton sharply. "Don't move!" the policeman shouted, the baton in his hands trembling as if ready to strike. "If you move again, I'll consider it resisting arrest." The crowd began to whisper. Someone quietly said, "This is too much." Someone pointed the camera closer. The policeman felt this pressure, but instead of stopping, his anger only increased. He needed to prove he was right, at any cost. "You're resisting," he said, looking at the teenager as if he were an enemy. "You always fight back. You're all the same. You think you can get around the law, that you can get away with anything." These words sounded like a guilty verdict. The policeman threw the empty bag to the ground, his breathing heavy, like a hunter preparing for the final blow. "I'm not resisting," screamed the teenager, his voice shaken but getting louder. "I didn't do anything. Why are you doing this to me?" But the officer only stepped closer, his face becoming malicious, almost bestial. "Why?" he interjected, leaning in so close that the teenager could feel his hot breath. "Because you're the problem. You and people like you. You ruin everything around you and then demand to be respected. Well, kid, respect has to be earned, and you have no idea what that means." The crowd around started to show more discontent. There were phrases like, "Leave him alone," "This is no longer work, it's bullying." But still, no one intervened. The policeman, hearing these words, turned to the people. "You all want to protect him?" he shouted, pointing his baton at the teenager. "You think he's innocent? I guarantee you, I see people like him every day. They steal, they lie, they hide behind their mommies. He's no better than the rest of them." The teenager stood, fists clenched, his breathing getting heavier. A feeling of powerlessness mixed with anger grew inside him. He couldn't understand why this man, this officer, hated him so much without even knowing his name. "Well, boy, have you anything else to say?" the officer continued, now openly mocking. "Or will you finally realize that no one can save you in this world?" The teenager wanted to answer, but the words stuck in his throat. He looked at the food scattered around him, at the milk spilled on the pavement, and at the faces of the people who looked at him with pity but did nothing to help. At that moment, he realized that to the policeman he had never been a human being, only a target, an object of hatred that had to be broken to prove his power. Let's pause for one more brief moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from, and whether something similar has happened to you or your loved ones. We care to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. And now we continue. The crowd was thickening, tension in the air, as if a thunderstorm was ready to break at any second. The teenager stood with clenched teeth, his gaze fixed on the pavement, but his hands trembled faintly. The policeman, noticing this, smirked. He felt his authority, his power. But at that moment the teenager suddenly raised his head. His voice, trembling but full of desperation, cut through the noise of the crowd. "Let me call my mom." The policeman froze for a split second, and then laughed loudly, leaning closer to the teenager. The laugh was filled with mock contempt, as if he thought the idea was ridiculous. "Mom?" he asked, stretching the word. "You want to call your mommy? What's she gonna do? Come here and save you?" He looked at the crowd, getting their attention, and continued as if he were speaking on stage. "It's always the same. Call my mom, call my dad. Like I don't know how it ends. Tell me, kid, is your mom a lawyer? Or maybe she's a janitor and you're hoping her tears will make me feel better?" The crowd froze. Some sighed indignantly, some looked away, but everyone waited to see what would happen next. The teenager, feeling the anger boiling up inside, repeated more firmly, "I have the right to call my mom. Let me make the call." The policeman frowned. He didn't like the boy's sudden show of strength. He stepped closer, peering into the teenager's eyes as if he wanted to read the fear in them. "You have the right to do what I tell you to do, and nothing else," he said threateningly, his voice as cold as steel. "But you know what? Make the call. See what your mommy says." He abruptly pulled a walkie-talkie out of his pocket, but instead of handing the phone to the teenager, he held it to his ear with a chuckle. "Tell her baby got caught red-handed. See what she says to that." The teenager tried to hold back the anger and humiliation. He knew that his every word, every movement would be used against him now. "I'll make the call myself," he said, his voice calm but firm. The cop smirked, tossing the walkie-talkie into his hands. "Come on, surprise me." The teenager dialed the number with shaky hands. Every second he waited for an answer, the tension became unbearable. The crowd fell silent as they watched this strange moment. "Mom," the teenager said, barely holding back tears. "Mom, I need help." the policeman. He stopped me, accusing me of something I didn't do. A calm but firm voice sounded on the other end of the line. "Where are you? Give me the address." The teenager named the intersection, his voice low, as if he was afraid it would anger the policeman. When the woman heard the address, she said only 2 words. "Wait for me." The policeman stood nearby, arms crossed over his chest. He shook his head, looking at the teenager with a sarcastic grin. "So, is Mommy on her way?" he asked. "You know what I think? She'll come over, yell at you, and we'll end this little drama. That's the way it always works." But something in the teenager's voice alerted the crowd. He no longer looked broken. He raised his head, and there was a shadow of confidence in his eyes. This did not escape the scrutiny of the onlookers, but the policeman, preoccupied with his show of power, noticed nothing. It was no more than 10 minutes, but every second felt like an hour. There was the sound of an engine in the distance, and then a black car pulled into the intersection. It stopped at the curb, and a woman got out. She was tall, slender, and dressed in a slim suit, and she walked confidently toward the policeman. "Is that your mom?" the policeman asked mockingly, looking at the woman. "Well, let's see what she has to say." But as she stepped closer, his self-confidence began to falter. There was something in her gaze that made him straighten up. She pulled her ID out of her pocket and held it up for all to see. "Judge Lorraine Carter," she introduced herself in a cold, clear voice. "You are accusing my son." The crowd froze, breathless, watching this dramatic encounter. The policeman, who only a few minutes ago had seemed the embodiment of power and authority, now looked confused and agitated. Judge Lorraine Carter stood before him like an immovable wall, and her son, whom he had humiliated, was finally able to straighten up behind her back, as if finding protection in her confidence. She took a step forward, and her voice sounded loud, clear, and without a single note of doubt. "Officer, do you realize that by your actions you have violated several articles of the law?" The policeman squinted, trying to maintain a semblance of control. "I was just doing my job, Judge Carter. Your son, Shut up," she interrupted him with a sharp wave of her hand. "You exceeded your authority by making an unwarranted stop. You accused my son of stealing without evidence. Moreover, you publicly humiliated him, threatened him with violence, and physically assaulted him." Her words sounded like hammer blows, and the crowd around her began filming more and more actively. The phone cameras were now pointed directly at them, and voices echoed through the crowd. "Yeah, she's right. It's all on video. He's not getting away with it. That's what he needs." The policeman felt sweat breaking out on his forehead. His face reddened and his breathing became heavier. He tried to object. "Look," he fought back. "Resistance?" Lorraine interrupted him with icy sarcasm in her voice. "Resisting what, officer? Your unreasonable orders? Your right to threaten a child with a truncheon? Or resistance to your bias?" She took a step closer, almost touching him with her gaze. "By your logic, anyone who dares to ask for an explanation is already guilty. Is that how you defend the law? Or are you just playing the role of a judge, sentencing the innocent on the spot?" The policeman tried to find words, but they wouldn't come. Her words were hitting every one of his excuses. His gaze darted between the crowd, the cameras, and Lorraine herself. "You don't know anything about my work," he blurted out, trying to regain some of his lost dignity. "Every day I encounter people like him." "Like him?" Lorraine interrupted him again, her voice even louder. "Do you realize that right now, here, in front of these people, you are openly displaying racial bias?" "People like him." Who are they, officer? Are they people of a different color? Are they kids who buy groceries and just want to go home? The crowd began to outrage louder. The policeman, sensing that the situation was getting out of control, began to back away. That's not what I meant. Oh, but that's exactly what you said. Lorraine cut him off, her voice sounding like a sentence. You have shown everyone that you are not a defender of the law. You are a disgrace to the system you claim to represent. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Take his badge off. He has to answer for this." The policeman took a step back, his arms no longer folded confidently across his chest. Now he looked small, pathetic, and utterly confused. Lorraine noticed this and seized the moment. "I demand that you apologize to my son," she said firmly. "Now, in front of all these people." "Apologize?" His voice trembled. He didn't expect the situation to go this far. "Judge, that's what you have to do if you want to keep any shred of your dignity." Lorraine interrupted him again. Her gaze was like a blade. "Or would you rather explain your behavior in front of the disciplinary board and at the trial?" The policeman froze. He knew that any word he said could now be used against him. He looked back at the crowd, whose faces expressed condemnation and indignation. His gaze fell on the teenager, who now stood with a straight back, feeling secure for the first time during this terrible evening. "Yeah." The policeman squirmed, his voice sounding like a whisper. He swallowed, then spoke louder, but with no conviction. "I apologize for my behavior." The crowd exploded with applause and cheers. Someone shouted out, "That's it." Someone laughed with relief. But for the policeman, it was the most humiliating moment of his life. Lorraine looked at him coldly. She realized that the apology was insincere, but she knew it wouldn't end there. Her face remained unruffled, but inside she felt anger. Anger at the system that allowed someone like this officer to gain power. "Now, take your hands off my son," she said quietly but firmly. The policeman nodded, releasing the teenager. He turned away, trying to hide his face, but the cameras kept filming him from all sides. Lorraine took her son's hand and, with one last glance at the policeman, said quietly, "It's not over yet." She turned and led her son away, leaving the officer standing in the center of the judgmental crowd. But her words echoed in the air, like a warning that justice always catches up with those who think they are above the law. The story that happened on the deserted street didn't end the moment Lorraine Carter took her son away. Its repercussions echoed far beyond that intersection. Each participant, whether a police officer, a teenager, or a casual onlooker, forever carried with them a lesson that made them rethink their views on justice, bias, and the power of truth. The next morning, the policeman's name was on everyone's lips. Video footage shot by eyewitnesses went viral on social networks, garnering millions of views. People were outraged by his behavior, discussing his every phrase and movement. Under the footage where he threatened a teenager with a baton, hundreds of thousands of comments condemned his actions. Soon, a formal complaint was made to the officer. Lorraine Carter, using her influence and knowledge of the law, insisted on an internal investigation. She gathered all the evidence, from eyewitness testimony to video of the scene. The evidence was irrefutable. The policeman tried to justify himself by claiming that he had acted within the scope of his authority. He cited the fact that the situation allegedly called for toughness. But no one, not even his colleagues, could support him once the truth came out. His superiors were quick to distance themselves from him, lest the department's reputation be damaged. 2 weeks later, the policeman received an official notice of dismissal. His career, built on a false confidence in his power, had collapsed. He had become a symbol of how quickly the abuse of power can turn against a man. His face, now familiar to all, became a reminder that bias will not go without consequences. For the teenager, the incident left deep wounds. Despite his mother's support and the triumph of justice, the sense of humiliation haunted him for a long time. He often remembered how the cold asphalt cut his knees, how the policeman looked at him as if he were insignificant. He had nightmares in which he heard the threatening sound of the baton again. "Why did this happen?" he asked his mother one day, sitting at the kitchen table. His voice was quiet, but there was pain in it. "What did I do wrong?" Lorraine, who had always tried to be strong for him, was silent for a moment. Then she leaned toward him, took his hand, and looked straight into his eyes. "You didn't do anything," she said firmly. "But sometimes the way you look is enough for people to hate you. It's unfair, it hurts, but it's not your fault." Her words were like a balm to his soul. Gradually, he began to recover. He realized that strength is not in not being afraid, but in continuing to live in spite of fear. This case did not go unnoticed. It became the catalyst for a long discussion about racial bias and abuse of power. People started talking about it louder, demanding change. The police department where the fired officer worked started anti-bias training, mandatory for every officer. "This must not happen again," the police chief said at a press conference. "We must restore people's trust in our system." Video from the scene continued to circulate. It was a reminder to many. Bias can destroy lives, but the truth can bring justice. Lorraine knew this case was not an isolated incident. She used her platform to speak out about systemic issues. Her speeches in courts and at public events attracted a wide audience. She wrote an article for a major publication describing that night and calling for reform. "I am not just fighting for my son," she wrote. "I fight for all those who cannot speak for themselves, who face injustice every day and feel helpless." Her words were inspiring. She became a symbol of strength and courage, an example of how important it is to stand on the side of truth, even when it is difficult. This story changed everyone involved forever. The policeman realized that power is a responsibility, not a tool for suppression. The teenager learned to be strong even in the face of injustice. Lorraine proved that justice is possible if you fight for it to the end. And society has learned a lesson that cannot be forgotten. Every moment of that night was a reminder. Bias is destructive. It humiliates, it breaks, it sows fear. But truth, backed by courage and determination, can overcome it. And that is a lesson that everyone should remember. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you or your loved ones experienced similar cases of racism? Your opinions are very important to us. We appreciate each of you and thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and let more people know about this story. We wish you a good day.